Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're taking a look at the ethics of human-human chimeras, and for this one we're going to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Oh, this is a good one. This is one where the science is pushing ahead and our moral intuitions and, our philosophical concepts maybe haven't quite caught up yet, so this will be fun.
Well, let's define our terms first. So what is a chimera when we're talking about the science here?
So in the strict biological sense, a chimera is just any individual that's composed of cells with different embryonic origins.
Okay.
And actually, it turns out that a lot of us are probably chimeras ourselves.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so there's a lot of transfer of fetal cells during pregnancy. So a pregnant woman will have cells from her fetus. A fetus will have cells from its mother.
Wow.
And even things like mosquito bites can introduce foreign cells into your body.
Oh, interesting.
And then there's the really wild one, which is that sometimes early embryos will fuse together and you'll get a single individual that's actually derived from two different embryos.
Yeah. Wow. That's pretty wild. So we've got these naturally occurring chimeras, but then we also have laboratory-created chimeras.
Right. So this has been going on for quite a while. A classic example is the geep, this sheep-goat hybrid.
Yeah.
Usually what they do is they combine early embryos from a sheep and a goat, and you get this kind of creature. It's sort of half sheep and half goat.
Yeah.
There's some really neat work that's been done transferring like vocalizations between quails and chicks. So they'll transplant portions of the developing nervous system, and you can actually change the sounds that the chick makes.
Interesting.
And then one that is super, super common and important in research is mice chimeras. So what they do is they'll take embryonic stem cells from one mouse, they'll genetically engineer them, and they'll introduce them into another mouse embryo at a very early stage.
Okay.
So, and these are useful for a whole bunch of things, like studying the function of genes and even breeding. You can use them to breed non-chimeric offspring with certain genetic alterations.
Right, right.
Yeah.
So, but I guess the real ethical fireworks start when we introduce human cells into the picture.
Right. So that's where the real focus of this deep dive is going to be. It's chimeras that are formed by introducing human pluripotent stem cells, or their derivatives, into non-human animals. And pluripotent is really important here. It means that these cells can develop into any kind of tissue in the body.
Right.
And stem cells in general have this property of self-renewal, which means they can just keep on making copies of themselves.
Right.
And so this makes them really, really promising for a lot of areas of research, like drug discovery, regenerative medicine,
Right.
the idea that we could grow replacement tissues and organs. And a really key event in all of this was the isolation of human embryonic stem cells, or HESCs, back in 1998.
So, but this, like a lot of these, really cutting-edge areas of science, this is one that has ignited a lot of ethical debate.
Yes. So the creation of these HPSC-based chimeras sparked a lot of discussion in bioethics. Some people have even called it the other stem cell debate, right? Kind of going on alongside the debate about human embryonic stem cell research.
Right, right.
And in this debate, 5 main arguments have sort of emerged over time, and that's what we're going to be looking at in this deep dive. So kind of using those as a framework to think through all the ethical and philosophical issues.
Okay. Well, let's jump right in then. What's the first big ethical concern that's been raised?
I think a really natural place to start is with this concern about unnaturalness. So people who make this argument will say, look, it's wrong to be creating these sorts of things. It's unnatural.
Okay, so the unnaturalness argument. So we're messing with nature. Is that essentially the idea? Like we're crossing some kind of natural boundaries that we shouldn't be crossing?
Yeah.
Specifically, between species.
Yeah, that's kind of the idea. That there are these natural species boundaries and we're messing with them, and there's something intrinsically wrong with doing that. But philosophically, this argument gets a little tricky pretty quick.
Okay, how so? I mean, on the face of it, the idea that species are distinct categories, that seems pretty straightforward. Why is it tricky?
Well, one tricky thing is figuring out what we even mean by species. So philosophers of biology, like Robert and Baylis, they point out that biologists themselves use a bunch of different species concepts. So, you've got the familiar one, the biological species concept, reproductive isolation, can two organisms interbreed and produce fertile offspring? But then you've also got things like genetic isolation, shared evolutionary ancestry, and even things like homeostatic property clusters, which are kind of a stable cluster of traits. So there's not one universally accepted definition of species.
Right.
And that, from a philosophical standpoint, that can make it difficult to say, well, it's wrong to violate natural species boundaries if we don't have a good grip on what those boundaries are.
Right, right. But even if the definition is fuzzy, it still seems like, at least intuitively, that there's something to this idea that there are these fundamental differences between, humans and other animals.
Right, and I think that's an important point, right? That even if a concept is hard to define, that doesn't mean it doesn't have moral significance.
Right. Right.
So, if you think about concepts like justice or consciousness, these are notoriously difficult to pin down. But we still think that they're really important morally. Now, with species, the other tricky thing is that, nature itself doesn't always respect these boundaries. So if you look over evolutionary timescales, species fuse, they split, you get the rise of new species, the extinction of old species. Hybridization does occur naturally in the animal world. It's not super common. And then, in the microbial world, horizontal gen transfer, right, where you have genes moving between different species, this is just like a basic evolutionary mechanism. So it's not like nature is completely rigid about species boundaries.
Right, right. But, I mean, it still seems like there's a difference between, natural gene swapping in bacteria versus, us intentionally mixing human and animal cells in a lab.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point, right? That just because something happens in nature doesn't mean that it's okay for us to do it,
Right.
or that our doing it makes it natural
Yeah.
in some kind of, morally relevant sense.
Right.
I mean, you could think about all sorts of societal boundaries, right? Like family structures, the
Yeah.
boundaries of citizenship. These have changed a lot over time, but that doesn't mean that they're not morally important.
Right, right. So if we take this idea of, unnaturalness equals wrongness, if we push that to its logical conclusion, where does that leave us?
Yeah, so this is a real problem for the argument, right? Because if just crossing species lines is enough to make something unnatural and therefore wrong, then, well, we'd have to condemn a lot of things. Mules, those are sterile hybrids of horses and donkeys.
Right.
The hybrid lilies in your garden. Arguably, all of human activity, from agriculture to technology to medicine, these all involve intervening in nature in some way. So, if unnatural just means wrong, then pretty much everything we do is wrong, which just seems crazy.
Yeah, that doesn't really get us anywhere.
Yeah.
So how do people who make this argument, how do they try to refine it to avoid these kinds of absurd consequences?
Well, one thing they'll do is they'll distinguish between like intrinsic and extrinsic objections to unnaturalness. So extrinsic objections, those are the ones that focus on the bad consequences of whatever it is that we're calling unnatural.
Okay.
So in the context of chimeras, this might be concerns about like environmental impacts. If we were to accidentally release a chimeric organism into the wild, could it have some sort of unforeseen ecological consequence?
Right.
Although these concerns are usually dealt with by regulations about how the research is conducted, public health risks, like is there a chance that a zoonotic disease could emerge?
Right.
And there was actually one case where a pig virus was able to transfer to human cells within a pig chimera. Although the risk with these human-to-animal chimeras is probably lower than the risk that we worry about with xenotransplantation, right, which is transplanting organs from animals into humans.
Right.
And then there are concerns about animal welfare, which are going to depend, of course, on what kind of moral status we give to these animals, and we'll talk about that more later. But the main point is that with these extrinsic objections, the wrongness is tied to the bad effects, not just to the fact that it's unnatural.
Right. Right. So it's not that the chimera itself is wrong, it's that it might lead to something bad.
Exactly.
What about these intrinsic objections then?
Yeah.
Where the act itself is supposed to be morally wrong, regardless of the consequences.
Yeah. So here you've got a few different versions of the argument. Some people just say, look, the unnaturalness itself is the wrong. Others will say, well, it's wrong because it violates some kind of divine order.
Right.
Right? Like we're messing with God's creation,
Right.
or we're transgressing against nature's inherent purposes.
Right.
And this is where you get this playing God argument, right? Which is really common in a lot of these debates about biotechnology. The idea that we're stepping outside of our proper role by trying to manipulate life in this way.
Right. I mean, what's the response to that, though? Because you could say, our curiosity, our drive to understand the world, that's part of our nature, too.
Yeah, exactly. And some people have actually made that argument, right? Like Comstock has said, look, if we're made in the image of God, and, if God values things like intellect and understanding, then maybe scientific inquiry is actually part of what we're supposed to be doing.
Right.
Why is exploring the biological world any more playing God than, creating art or developing philosophical theories?
Right.
But even if we grant that there's something to this idea of intrinsic wrongness, it doesn't follow that all unnatural acts are wrong.
Right.
Right? We might still have good reasons to do certain things, like if there's a huge medical benefit. Or, we can gain some really crucial scientific knowledge. And as Mill pointed out, objections to our power over nature are usually only directed at things that go beyond a certain degree in a certain admitted range.
Right.
So the context really matters. Moral philosophers like Dancy have also talked about this. How the moral relevance of something is often going to depend on the details of the situation.
Right. So it seems like the real problem for the unnaturalness argument is to give us a principled way to distinguish between those unnatural acts that are wrong and those that aren't.
Exactly. And Thompson has made this point specifically about genetic manipulation.
Right.
Is there a principled difference between what we're doing when we're, say, altering DNA and what we've been doing for centuries with, plant and animal breeding?
Right.
Or developing agriculture? All of these things change the natural world in pretty significant ways. And this is where you sometimes hear this yuck factor being brought into the discussion.
The yuck factor. You mean that, like, visceral feeling of disgust?
Yeah. So the idea is that sometimes our gut reactions can kind of tell us that something's wrong, even if we can't, fully articulate why.
Right.
And Cass is one of the people who's made this argument. He says, look, sometimes we just feel like something's wrong and that feeling's telling us something important. Maybe we just have this deep intuition that these chimeras are wrong and we should listen to that.
Yeah, but philosophically, that seems like a really dangerous road to go down.
Yeah.
I mean, historically, those kinds of gut feelings have been used to justify all sorts of bad things.
Yeah, and I think we should be very skeptical of using the yuck factor as our main moral compass.
Right.
History is full of examples where people's strong feelings have led them to do terrible things.
Right.
But the people who defend the yuck factor will say, look, just because an intuition's been misused doesn't mean it's always wrong. And they'll point to cases where, maybe our gut reaction is pointing us towards something that's genuinely morally problematic. Remember that thought experiment where, you have to choose between killing one healthy person to save 5 other people?
Yeah.
A lot of people have this really strong reaction against that, even if they can't quite say why.
Right.
So they'll say, look, there are cases where those feelings are picking up on something real.
Okay, so I can kind of see that in these really extreme cases.
Mm-hmm.
But how does that apply to, a mouse that's got a few human cells in it? I mean, I don't think most people are going to have this strong yuck reaction to that.
Yeah, and I think that's the problem here. So, if the unnaturalness argument is saying, look, just calling something unnatural isn't enough to show that it's wrong, you've got to appeal to these intuitions, well, then you're basically just saying it's wrong because it's unnatural and that feels wrong to me. And that's not going to be very persuasive to someone who doesn't share that feeling.
Right.
Unlike the organ transplant case where you can actually give reasons why it's wrong. You're harming someone, you're violating their rights. It's really hard to say what's intrinsically wrong about unnaturalness in a way that doesn't depend on these kinds of gut feelings. To say that it's unnatural, therefore it's wrong, that's just not a good argument. So the unnaturalness argument, I think, it raises some important issues, but philosophically it doesn't really hold up that well.
Okay, so that's the first argument. What's the next big ethical concern that's been raised?
So the next big one has to do with this idea of moral confusion.
Moral confusion.
Yeah, and this argument is really associated with the work of Robert and Bayliss. They've written a lot about this. And the basic idea is that, if we start creating these entities that blur the lines between humans and non-humans, well, this is going to lead to a lot of uncertainty about how we should treat them morally.
Okay.
And they say, look, we've got these 2 basic frameworks for thinking about moral status. So, on the one hand, if you're a human being, then you've got full moral status.
Right.
Right. And this is usually seen as inherent to being human. It doesn't depend on your abilities or what other people think of you.
Right.
But then on the other hand, for non-human animals, they're generally not considered to have full moral status.
Right.
And whatever moral consideration they get is going to depend on a bunch of different things, like our attitudes towards them, their instrumental value to us.
Right.
So we treat pets differently than we treat animals that are raised for food.
Right.
So the problem is that when you get these chimeras, it's not clear which set of rules you should apply.
Right.
Right. So, you get this creature that's kind of in between and you're like, well, is it okay to use it the way we use animals, or is that like harming a human being?
Right.
And then what kind of research ethics should apply? Should we use, the less strict rules for animal research or the much stricter rules for human subjects research?
Right.
So it's just really unclear what the moral rules are, and that can lead to a lot of confusion and potentially, really bad decisions.
Right. So we have to come up with a whole new system of ethics to deal with these things.
Yeah, that's the worry. And there's a real world example of this that I think illustrates it really well. So back in 1998, Jeremy Rifkin and Stuart Newman, they tried to patent a whole bunch of different chimeras that would be created by combining human and non-human embryonic cells. And at the time, U.S. patent law said that you couldn't patent a human being, but you could patent other multicellular living organisms, including animals. So Rifkin and Newman, what they were trying to do was they wanted to either, get the patent, which would then potentially prevent people from creating these chimeras, or they wanted to get their application rejected in a way that would force the patent office to, like, lay out the criteria for what makes something a human being.
Okay.
So they were trying to kind of force this issue.
Right. And what happened?
Well, the patent was eventually rejected, and the grounds were technical and also that they deemed it to include human beings.
Okay.
But the patent office didn't give any criteria for determining when a chimera counts as a human being. So, the takeaway is that we've got these existing practices, like patent law, and these practices are built on this assumption that there's a clear distinction between humans and non-humans.
Right.
And when you get these chimeras, well, they kind of undermine that assumption. So now we're like, well, wait a minute. How do our laws and our social practices apply to these things? And, the implications are pretty broad, right? Like,
Yeah.
What about civil rights, criminal law? All of these things could potentially be affected.
Yeah. So the argument isn't just that, individual people are going to be confused about how to act. It's that, our whole society could be thrown into turmoil by this.
Yeah, and that's really what Robert and Bayless are arguing. They say, look, we've got this basic idea that to have full moral status, you have to be human. And that idea is built into a lot of our social institutions.
Right.
And so if we start messing with that idea, well, we're messing with the foundations of our society.
Right. Right. So that sounds pretty serious. What are the counterarguments to this? How do people who disagree with this argument, how do they respond?
Well, one response is just empirical. They'll say, look, there's not really any evidence that this moral confusion is what's actually driving people's opposition to chimera research.
Okay.
And there have been surveys of public attitudes towards biotechnology. And these surveys suggest that, the things that people are really worried about are, playing God and interfering with nature.
Right.
Not so much about this categorization problem.
Okay.
So even if those worries are unfounded, at least those seem to be the things that are actually on people's minds. And then another response is just to say, look, the confusion just isn't that likely to happen.
Mm-hmm.
The chimeras that have been created so far have been pretty easy to categorize.
Good.
Like a mouse with a few human cells in it is still pretty clearly a mouse.
Right.
And, it's not like those kinds of things haven't existed before. If you have a heart valve replacement and it's from a pig, well, you're not suddenly less human.
Right.
So they'll say, look, just crossing species boundaries doesn't automatically mean that we're going to have this moral meltdown. And even if we do get these really borderline cases in the future, where it's really not clear whether something is human or non-human, some people will argue, well, the confusion might not actually be that big of a deal.
Okay.
So, imagine a chimera that's got, a really high degree of autonomy. It can reason, it's self-aware, it can communicate. Well, even if it's not biologically human, a lot of people would say, look, that thing deserves moral status.
Right.
And philosophers like Siegel have made this point. It's the personhood conferring properties that matter, not just whether you happen to be a member of the species Homo sapiens.
Right.
And the people who are making the mistake of thinking that you have to be human to have full moral status, well, maybe they just need to update their beliefs. They're confronted with this counterexample and they realize, oh, okay, I guess I was wrong about that. So the confusion would probably be limited to people who already have these really specific and kind of questionable beliefs to begin with.
Okay. So what about the case where you have something that's, clearly not a person, but it's got some human material in it?
Yeah.
Would that be a problem?
So there might be some confusion there. And it's going to depend on what people's existing beliefs are about the moral status of embryos.
Mm,
So imagine a chimpanzee embryo, very early stage, that's received some human embryonic stem cells.
okay.
So someone who thinks that human embryos don't have full moral status until they develop consciousness, well, they'll probably say the same thing about this chimeric embryo.
Right.
On the other hand, someone who thinks that human embryos do have full moral status from conception, well, they might be a little bit more troubled by this case. But the point is that, even if there's some confusion about this particular scenario, it's not clear that that means we have to rethink our whole view of human moral status.
So kind of like, intersex people.
Oh.
So you have these people who don't fit neatly into the male-female binary.
Right.
And that can, challenge our assumptions about biological sex, but it doesn't usually make people doubt that there's such a thing as male and female, or that, brother means what it means.
Right, right.
So the worry is that we're going to have to throw out all of our existing moral categories just because of these few weird cases. And that just doesn't seem very likely.
Okay. So it seems like the confusion, even if it does happen, is probably going to be pretty limited.
Yeah. And then I think the final point to make about this moral confusion argument is that, even if there is some confusion, that's not necessarily a reason to stop doing the research.
Okay.
Right? So throughout history, a lot of moral progress has actually come from us being willing to question our existing categories and our assumptions.
So, our views on animal welfare, on human equality, these have changed over time. And that change often started with people being like, wait a minute, are we sure about this?
Right.
So just because research might lead us to rethink some of our moral beliefs, that doesn't mean the research itself is unethical. I mean, think about the patent law example. So maybe dealing with these chimeric organisms is going to lead to some changes in patent law, and maybe we won't like all of those changes, but that doesn't mean that Rifkin and Newman were wrong to bring up the issue in the first place.
Right.
Sometimes we have to grapple with these hard questions in order to figure out what the right thing to do is.
Right. Okay. So that's the moral confusion argument. What's the next one?
So the next argument focuses on great apes, and it's often called the borderline personhood argument. So chimpanzees, gorillas, bonobos, orangutans. And this is an argument that's been made most prominently by de Grazia.
Borderline person. So what makes these animals borderline?
So de Grazia says, look, great apes, they've got a lot of the psychological characteristics that we usually think are relevant to personhood,
Okay.
but they don't quite reach the threshold for, full personhood in the way that we usually think about it.
Okay. And so how does he define personhood here?
So for de Grazia, being a person isn't about what species you belong to. It's about having a certain kind of complex consciousness.
Right.
And he gives us a bunch of properties that are supposed to contribute to this. So, autonomy, rationality, self-awareness, linguistic competence, sociability, moral agency, the ability to act intentionally. So his idea is that if you have enough of these properties to a high enough degree, then you're a person.
Okay, so how do great apes stack up against this list? Why does he think that they might be borderline?
So there's a ton of research on great apes, and it shows that they can do a lot of really impressive things. They can plan, they can reason, they show evidence of self-awareness, they recognize themselves in mirrors and they'll use mirrors to examine parts of their bodies that they couldn't otherwise see. They have complex social structures, they transmit knowledge within their communities. There's even some evidence that they might be capable of altruism.
Okay, that's a pretty impressive list.
Yeah.
So what's missing then? Why doesn't he just say, okay, they're persons?
So the main limitation, according to de Grazia, is that they don't have full-blown language the way that humans do.
Okay.
So, some great apes have been able to learn to use symbols to communicate,
Right.
but it's not as complex or as flexible as human language.
Right.
And he thinks that this linguistic limitation might hold them back in terms of developing some of the other capacities that are really important for personhood, like abstract thought, really complex social interactions.
Right.
So he says that non-linguistically trained great apes, they don't clearly qualify as persons when you compare them to, say, human children who, have this introspective awareness, they develop language, they're more clearly autonomous. And he's careful to say, look, this isn't just because we don't know enough about them. It's a genuine difference in their capacities.
Okay, so they're borderline. So what does that mean ethically?
Yeah, so that's the big question. Do they get some of the moral consideration that we give to persons?
Right.
Or do they just get treated like regular animals?
Right.
And The answer is going to depend on your theory of moral status.
Okay.
So some people think that moral status is all or nothing.
Yeah.
Either you have it or you don't. And if sentience is enough to get you full moral status, well, then great apes would have it
Right.
because they're clearly sentient.
Right.
But other people think that moral status comes in degrees. There's kind of a sliding scale.
Mhm.
And de Grazia talks about two different models for this. So you've got the unequal consideration model, which says that the interests of persons just matter more, like intrinsically. And then you've got the unequal interests model, which says that persons tend to have more important interests, because their lives are more complex.
Okay.
So how do these models apply to borderline persons? Well, de Grazia says, look, because they have a lot of the properties that are relevant to personhood, they probably deserve either full or near full moral status.
Okay.
So on the unequal consideration model, the more complex you are cognitively, emotionally, socially, the more moral consideration you get. And borderline persons are pretty complex.
Right.
And then on the unequal interests model, the difference between a borderline person and a full person in terms of the kinds of interests they have, it's not that big.
Right.
Especially when you compare it to the difference between a borderline person and, something like a worm.
Right.
So de Grazia says, look, we should basically think of borderline persons as being analogous to human children. They're not fully autonomous, but we still give them really strong moral protections. We don't do research on them that's not in their best interests. We don't subject them to more than minimal risk, unless there's a really good reason. And, ideally, we get their consent. So the idea is that we should be treating great apes pretty much the same way.
So if that's the case, then a lot of this research that people want to do with great apes, especially this neurochimeric research,
Yeah.
that would be off the table.
Yeah, that's right. So if you're trying to enhance their cognitive capacities, well, you're doing something that's more than minimally risky.
Right.
It's not for their benefit.
Right.
And you can't get their consent. And de Grazia, he has this really striking example where he talks about, what would it be like to be a human chimp chimera?
Right.
You wouldn't really fit in anywhere. You'd be rejected by both humans and chimps. It would just be a really awful existence. So he's saying, look, even if it's not that extreme, a lot of this research is just going to cause harm and suffering.
Right.
And if these animals have near full moral status, well, we can't do that.
Okay, so what are the objections to this argument? Because it seems like, if we take it seriously, it has really big implications for how we do research on animals.
Yeah, and people who defend animal research, they really don't like this argument.
Yeah.
So one objection is that, if moral status is all or nothing, and if sentience is enough to get you full moral status, then that means we'd have to apply these really strict rules to all research on vertebrate animals.
Right.
Which they say is just not feasible.
Right.
It would shut down a ton of research. And then if moral status comes in degrees, the objection is,